Welcome to Campfire Horror Tales. Tonight, we take you deep into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where whispers echo through the trees and the forest remembers the names of those who wander too far. Gather close, keep your fire burning, and listen carefully. This is a true horror story from Appalachia, a place where the line between the living and the shadows doesn't exist. The drive into the Appalachians always felt endless, like the road itself was coiling deeper into some old dream. Asphalt thinned to cracked gray veins, running between hills that swallowed the horizon. Pines loomed tall and dark, pressing in closer mile by mile, their tops lost in a low ceiling of clouds. 4 friends sat inside the rattling SUV, their equipment bags stacked high in the back, cameras clicking every so often as if they were trying to trap the wilderness inside a lens. They called themselves the HoloLens, a small but growing YouTube channel built on late-night ghost hunts, folklore road trips, and urban legend investigations. Most of their audience tuned in for scares they could half believe. Abandoned houses, eerie back roads, a shadow in the corner of a motel room. But this trip was different. This time they weren't just chasing stories. They were driving straight into one. It was late afternoon when they rolled through the last gas station town before the mountains. The place looked like it had been frozen in the 1970s. Rusted signage, sun-faded advertisements, windows covered in dust. The people at the diner barely raised their eyes when the outsiders walked in. A gray-haired man at the counter muttered something low when he saw the cameras, something about kids filming where they don't belong. The crew laughed it off, but it lingered in the air, an unspoken warning that clung tighter than the smell of old grease and coffee. The road climbed higher. Houses disappeared, replaced by wooden crosses nailed to trees, little shrines sagging under rain-soaked flowers. Every turn brought more silence. Even the radio stuttered out. Nothing but static between bursts of mountain gospel from unseen stations. They found the trailhead just before sunset. The gravel lot was empty, except for their car, the wilderness stretching out in all directions like a black sea. The group unpacked in hurried motions, piling tripods, lanterns, and rations onto their backs. Each step down the trail pulled them deeper, the crunch of gravel beneath boots sounding too loud, like it was echoing in a place where no human should be. By the time they reached the clearing, the forest had gone heavy with dusk. They pitched their tents near the tree line, circling the campfire pit that looked as though others had stood here before, though no one had been around for years. Charred wood still lay in the ashes, half buried under leaves. Night bled across the mountains quickly. The fire crackled, throwing thin light that barely held back the dark. Surrounding them, the trees stood like a silent crowd, branches swaying though no wind moved through the clearing. The mountains had a way of making you feel like you were trespassing, like the land had never wanted you there. The crew busied themselves with checking lenses, batteries, audio recorders. One camera was aimed at the forest's edge, red light blinking, recording the shadows that seemed to lean closer. Another rested on a tripod aimed up the trail, capturing the emptiness behind them. The forest never stayed still. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Too heavy for a bird, too close for comfort. Leaves shifted, whispering in voices no one could quite follow. The mountains at night carried sound in strange ways. Footsteps could come from nowhere. Laughter could rise out of silence. They told themselves it was the reason they had come. To catch the Appalachians speaking, to prove that the old stories carried weight. Legends of the howlers, beings older than the hills themselves, said to mimic voices to lure travelers away. It was folklore they had read about online, whispers in Reddit threads, half-remembered tales from locals. But under the heavy sky, those stories no longer felt like campfire entertainment. They pressed against the night with a different kind of truth. The fire hissed as if something unseen had breathed on it. One of them turned on the audio recorder, leaving it near the pit while they set up a second camera deeper toward the tree line. Their footsteps crunched over the dirt path, then disappeared into silence when they stopped moving. That silence was heavier than anything. They could hear each other's breaths, the faint hum of insects, the endless stillness of the mountain pressing down. The forest gave nothing back, not yet. But the weight of being watched clung to them, subtle but undeniable. Each glance into the dark returned nothing but trees. Yet the feeling grew, a pressure just beyond sight. The night stretched long. The fire burned low, shadows twisting along the fabric of their tents. Cameras kept recording, little red eyes staring into the dark, waiting for movement. And then, at the edge of exhaustion, one of them swore they heard it. Their own name, drifting from the forest, spoken low, almost kind. The others laughed nervously, brushed it off as imagination, as mountain wind carrying sound the wrong way. But when they played the audio back hours later, long after the fire dimmed, there it was again. A voice that wasn't theirs, hidden in the static, whispering a name it should not have known. The first night in the Appalachians had only begun, and already the mountains were speaking. The mountain night never truly slept. It shifted and breathed like some enormous living thing, stretching its lungs in the darkness. The group lay scattered in their tents. Fire burned down to a dull orange glow, and the forest pressed against them with invisible weight. Every sound was sharper here. The crackle of cooling embers, the faint scuttle of insects, the occasional thud of something moving just out of sight. Sleep never came easy in the wilderness, not when the air was this heavy. Even through layers of fabric, the forest seemed to lean closer. The tents felt too thin, as if nothing separated the bodies inside from whatever stirred among the trees. Every creak of a branch carried weight. Every snap of a twig landed like a footstep. Around midnight, the first voice drifted through the stillness. It was faint, stretched thin by distance, but unmistakably human. A low call, like someone lost, echoing through the pines. The sound moved slowly, carrying words no one could fully catch. Then, clearer, it came again, this time shaping itself into something terrible. It called one of their names. The syllables were perfect, not shouted, not panicked, just spoken, soft, as if a friend were standing in the dark, waiting to be found. The name floated through the trees, bounced down the slope, and reached the camp with an intimacy that didn't belong in the wild. One of them stirred awake, heart hammering, unsure if it had been a dream. Another voice followed, different this time, quieter, but still familiar. It repeated a second name, slowly, with patience, as if whoever called knew exactly who lay in each tent. The night thickened. The fire gave its last spark, smoke trailing upward until it vanished into the dark canopy. The only light left came from the blinking red dots of their cameras. One of the lenses caught the shape of the tree line, black silhouettes etched against an even darker sky. When they listened closely, it wasn't just one voice. The forest carried several, layered and scattered, rising and falling as if more than one throat worked together to mimic what it had heard. The names repeated, stretched and distorted, sometimes too high, sometimes too low, but always close enough to sound human. Inside the tents, fear settled like frost. No one dared to move, but no one slept. Each breath felt loud. Each rustle of fabric sounded like betrayal, as if the voices outside were listening for the faintest noise. The thought became unbearable. If they could imitate their names, maybe they could imitate other things. Footsteps, laughter, pleas for help. At one point, something brushed against the nylon wall of a tent. A dragging sound, light but deliberate, tracing along the fabric as if a hand were sliding across it. The pressure was subtle, but real. Then silence again. When courage finally allowed one of them to peek outside, the clearing lay empty, the trees swaying slightly, though no wind stirred. They tried to convince themselves of explanations. Coyotes, mountain cats. The strange ways echoes worked in deep valleys, but each theory collapsed under the weight of detail, the accuracy of the names, the rhythm of the words, the way the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. An hour stretched into 2. At some point, one of the recorders captured something new. Not a voice this time, but a low hum, almost mechanical, resonating deep under the forest floor. It rolled like a pulse through the earth, enough to rattle loose dirt and shake the breath in their lungs. The hum grew and then vanished, leaving behind silence so thick it ached in their ears. Close to dawn, the forest seemed to retreat. The voices faded, dissolving into the background noise of insects waking with the light. Pale gray crept into the clearing, revealing tired eyes and trembling hands. None of them had truly slept, only drifted in and out of anxious half-dreams filled with shadows and whispers. When the sun finally broke over the ridges, the group emerged from their tents with the unease of people who had shared the same nightmare. Their faces said enough. Even without words, they understood that whatever had happened in the night was real. The cameras had been rolling the whole time. Batteries drained, memory cards filled. They gathered them quickly, desperate to see what the forest had offered. Playback revealed hours of darkness, the fire burning out, shifting shadows, the outlines of their tents. Nothing moved where it shouldn't have. At least, not until the moment the first voice broke the silence. There it was, recorded perfectly. A human voice, clear against the backdrop of forest static, whispering one of their names. Not once, but again and again, in different tones, at different distances. At times it sounded as if the speaker were right next to the microphone, exhaling each syllable. One of them turned away from the screen, unable to watch. Another leaned closer, drawn in, compelled by the confirmation that it hadn't been a trick of half-sleep. The mountain had spoken to them, and worse, it knew who they were. The second night was still ahead, but already the Appalachians were no longer just scenery. They had become something else, something alive. Morning in the Appalachians carried no comfort. The light was pale and thin, filtered through trees that seemed taller in daylight than they had at night, as if they had grown while the group slept. The forest floor was damp, slick with dew, and every step sank softly into moss and wet leaves. The friends packed their gear in silence, still haunted by the voices that had drifted through the darkness. No one wanted to admit how shaken they were. Fear sat unspoken between them, heavy and solid, as they broke camp and headed back down the trail. The small mountain town looked different by day. What had felt eerie in the fading light of yesterday now carried a brittle kind of normalcy. Children played near the rusted swings behind the church. A dog barked at them from a porch. Old trucks rattled along cracked roads. And yet, underneath the surface, something felt wrong. The smiles were brief, the eyes too watchful. Conversation ceased when the outsiders walked by. And behind the shutters, faces seemed to linger longer than politeness would allow. They decided to visit the town's small library, a squat brick building half hidden by overgrown hedges. The inside smelled of dust and mold, the scent of damp pages long ignored. The woman behind the desk was thin, her hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes sharp but tired. She asked nothing about their equipment, about their purpose, only nodded as if she already knew why they had come. The shelves were sparse, but tucked in a far corner they found local history collections, handwritten notes, brittle newspapers, yellowed pamphlets stapled together by hands long gone. The deeper they dug, the stranger the stories became. One article, dated nearly a century ago, described a series of disappearances along the very trails they had camped. Families vanished, their camps found intact, fires still warm, belongings untouched. Another entry told of hunters found weeks later, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, mouths frozen open as if caught mid-scream. But what drew their attention most was a bound collection of folklore. The pages spoke of figures the locals called the Hollow Men, beings said to live in the ridges and valleys, older than any settlement, older even than the mountains themselves. They were described as hunters of sound, creatures that stole voices the way others stole breath. They called out in tones that mirrored loved ones, imitating perfectly until the victim stepped willingly into the dark. A note scrawled in the margin of one page caught their eyes. In faded ink, it read, "If you hear your own name in the forest, it is already too late." They carried the book to the desk, but the librarian shook her head before they even spoke. Her gaze was fixed, lips pressed tight, as if she wished the thing had never been written at all. She did not answer questions, only muttered something low, something like a prayer, as she slipped the book back into their hands. The look in her eyes wasn't anger. It was pity. They left unsettled, the town around them suddenly heavier, the people's silence louder. Even the children had stopped their play, watching the outsiders with unreadable expressions. The four friends quickened their pace, moving toward the edge of town, with the book still clutched like a relic. The sun dipped lower as they hiked back toward their campsite. The air had cooled, and with it came the faint hum of insects. But layered beneath was something else, an almost imperceptible vibration, as though the earth itself murmured. The legend weighed on them. What they had heard last night now seemed less like imagination and more like an invitation. They set up camp again in the same clearing, though the firelight felt weaker against the approaching dusk. The book lay open beside their gear, the passages about the Hollow Men illuminated by flickering flames. Words looped through their thoughts, voices stolen, names repeated. The warning that once called, escape was already impossible. The forest grew restless. Owls stirred, and something large shifted in the underbrush, snapping branches as if it carried weight heavier than any deer. The silence after was suffocating. One of them pressed headphones over their ears, listening live to the recorder. Static buzzed, faint and steady, until a sound cut through. It was a voice, clear, direct, his own. The blood drained from his face as the others crowded around. Through the recorder, in perfect mimicry, his name rose again, spoken not once but twice, slow and measured. He tore the headphones off, shaking, but the others had already heard it. The firelight flickered wildly, and beyond the circle of tents, the forest stretched deeper, waiting. The Appalachians had not forgotten them. Night was falling again, and with it came the legends no longer bound to paper, no longer whispers in a book. The Hollow Men were real, and they were listening. The second night bled into the clearing with a heaviness that felt almost deliberate, as if the forest itself anticipated what was about to unfold. By the time the fire was built, the mountain ridges were nothing more than black teeth biting into a bruised sky. The group's voices were low, scattered, more a way to fight silence than to fill it. The folklore book lay open beside their lantern, the drawing of hollow-eyed figures watching from the page like witnesses. They decided this time to prepare. Cameras were mounted along the edges of the clearing, red lights blinking steadily. One was set to face the trail, another aimed at the tree line. An audio recorder was placed in the center of the camp, capturing every breath of wind, every crackle of the fire. Another camera was strapped to a tree, its angle tilted down, surveying the tents like a watchful eye. The forest received their precautions with indifference. The air grew colder, the fire's warmth unable to chase it away. Their laughter came forced, brittle, collapsing quickly into silence. The shadows stretched longer, darker, until they no longer resembled trees, but figures standing still, waiting. The first hours passed with only small disturbances. A branch fell in the distance, a rustle in the underbrush, low and steady, as though something circled the perimeter just out of sight. They tried to convince themselves that it was wildlife, a deer, perhaps, or a wandering bear. But the sound never wandered away. It lingered. It paced. Sometime after midnight, the recorder caught it. A faint shuffle, footsteps on leaves, too deliberate to be animal. Then came the voice again. This time there was no mistaking it. One of their names, spoken just beyond the tree line. Clear, patient, waiting. The fire popped loudly, sparks leaping upward, and in that instant, one of them swore he saw it, something at the edge of the clearing. A tall figure, motionless, almost blending into the trees. It did not move, yet its presence pulled at the air. A distortion like heat rising from asphalt. He blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic spread quiet but sharp. They huddled near the fire, pretending to focus on their equipment, but their eyes betrayed them, darting constantly to the shadows. The forest had taken on a new shape. The trees leaned closer, their branches twisted in angles that looked too much like limbs. Every space between trunks became a doorway, waiting to open. Hours later, when exhaustion finally overtook fear, they collapsed inside their tents, leaving the cameras to keep watch. At dawn, the clearing looked harmless again. Dew shimmered on the grass, the fire reduced to pale ashes. The forest hummed with the indifferent sounds of insects and birds. But the equipment told a different story. The first recording showed hours of stillness. The tents, the fire, the trees swaying faintly. Then, without warning, a shape slid into the frame. Not a person, not exactly. It was tall, lean, its outline warped as if the lens struggled to define it. For nearly 2 minutes, it stood near the tents, unmoving, its head tilted slightly toward the camera. And then it turned. Not walking, but shifting, folding into the tree line until it was gone. Another camera caught more. A pair of shapes this time, standing at opposite ends of the clearing. They didn't walk. They didn't sway. They simply existed, like cutouts pasted into the frame. Their eyes, or the dark spaces where eyes should have been, reflected faintly, catching light that wasn't there. The final recording was worse. The audio captured whispers layered over static. Not just names this time, but fragments of sentences. Words stretched into wrong shapes. Some sounded like laughter, others like sobs. At one point, a voice identical to one of their own said clearly, "Let me in." The group sat around the laptop in silence, the footage looping again and again. No one laughed. No one dismissed it as a trick of light or equipment. Their faces were drained of color, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The forest was no longer legend. It had moved closer, it had shown itself, and it had been watching. When they packed the equipment away, their hands shook. They whispered to one another about leaving, about driving back down the mountain before nightfall. Yet none of them moved toward the trail. Something unspoken kept them there. Fear, disbelief, or maybe a deeper pull. A fascination that had already burrowed into their minds. The clearing felt heavier now, the sunlight unable to push away what lingered in the trees. Every movement in the forest, every shift of shadow, carried a new weight. They were no longer documenting folklore. They had become part of it. And somewhere in the silence between the pines, something waited for night to fall again. The decision to stay was not spoken, but understood, as though leaving was no longer possible. The group spent the morning pretending at normalcy, boiling water, checking their gear, scribbling half-hearted notes about the night's recordings. Yet every glance toward the tree line betrayed the tension coiling in their chests. The forest did not look different, but it felt altered, as if it now contained a presence that watched each of their movements. By afternoon, the silence pressed heavier than before. Even the birds seemed muted, their calls few and far between. The air carried a thickness that had nothing to do with weather. Each gust of wind seemed to carry whispers not quite heard. A low vibration against the skin. It was around then that Aaron, restless, jittering, his nerves wearing thin, announced he would take a short walk down the trail. Just a stretch of the legs, he said. Nothing far. He wanted to clear his head, to shake off the cabin fever the clearing had already begun to breed. The others, too exhausted to argue, let him go. He carried a small flashlight and one of the audio recorders in his pocket, though it was still daylight. His figure disappeared quickly into the green, swallowed by trunks and shadows. They expected him to be back within the hour. He did not return. At first, they reassured one another. Perhaps Aaron had gone farther down the trail. Perhaps he'd found something worth recording. But unease turned to dread as the minutes stretched into hours. By dusk, panic had replaced patience. They shouted his name into the trees, voices breaking against the forest's indifference. Their calls carried but came back empty. No answering voice, no footsteps crashing toward them. Just silence. Two of them finally decided to search. They followed the trail Aaron had taken, leaving behind the others to tend the fire and guard the equipment. The path stretched narrow and winding, its soil uneven, its turns disorienting. Each bend in the trail felt like walking deeper into something that did not want them there. After what felt like half a mile, they stopped. In the dirt, faint and fresh, were footprints. Aaron's boots pressed clearly into the earth. They followed them, relief briefly warming their nerves, until the prints simply ended. One step, another, then nothing. The soil was smooth, undisturbed, as though he had vanished mid-stride. The two froze. The forest around them seemed to lean closer, listening. They whispered to each other, their breath quick, their hands shaking. No animal could erase tracks so completely. No person could vanish without a sign. And yet there it was. Proof of absence. Something flickered at the edge of their vision. Not movement exactly, more like the afterimage left when closing one's eyes too quickly. A tall figure, its outline sharp and wrong against the trees. They spun, but nothing was there. Only the forest, ancient and still. They did not stay to investigate further. Fear drove them back to the clearing, their bodies trembling, their minds fraying. The others saw their faces and understood before a word was spoken. Aaron was gone. Night fell heavier than before, smothering the clearing in a blackness that felt alive. The fire barely held back the dark. Shadows moved strangely, stretching too far, bending at angles no flame could cast. Each flicker seemed to create shapes that weren't there a moment earlier, shapes too tall, too still. One of them suggested reviewing the cameras again, hoping for some clue, some glimpse of where Aaron had gone. They played the footage back on the laptop, the images jittering and grainy. On one recording, Aaron was visible at the edge of the frame, walking toward the trail. He glanced once at the camera, his face pale, his expression tight. Then, seconds later, behind him, there was something else. A figure, tall and thin, emerging from the trees, its head bent forward, watching. Its limbs appeared too long, its outline fractured as though it existed in pieces. Aaron did not see it. He walked onward, vanishing into the trees. The figure followed a step later, then flickered, dissolving into static. The camera glitched for nearly a full minute before clearing again, showing only empty forest. They stopped the playback. No one spoke. The clearing seemed to throb with silence, every sound magnified. The hiss of the fire, the creak of shifting branches, their own ragged breathing. They tried to comfort themselves with reason, to insist Aaron had simply gotten lost. But reason no longer fit here. The forest had taken him. As the night deepened, whispers brushed the edges of their camp, not carried by wind, but purposeful, circling. Sometimes the voices sounded like Aaron's, calling faintly for help. Other times they were unrecognizable. Too many layered together, a chorus of those who had vanished before. Sleep was impossible. They huddled closer to the fire, eyes fixed on the shadows, waiting for shapes to emerge. Every so often, they thought they saw him. A figure just beyond the glow, standing still. But when they looked harder, it melted into the trees. By dawn, the group was broken, their nerves shredded, their hope gone. They knew Aaron was not coming back. The forest had made that clear. And yet, in the pit of their fear, another realization settled like ice. The forest was not finished. By the third night, the clearing had become a cage. The fire no longer offered comfort. It felt like the last fragile barrier between them and the weight pressing in from the woods. Each of them sat in silence, hollow-eyed, flinching at every crack of a branch, every shift of wind. Sleep had become impossible, food tasteless. They were frayed to the edges, worn thin by a presence that had not shown itself fully, but had made its hunger known. It began with the voices again, but stronger now. Not whispers carried faintly on the air, but direct, immediate, as though someone leaned close enough to breathe against their ears. They came from all directions at once, overlapping, folding into one another, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Sometimes they heard Aaron, clear, pleading, his voice asking for help, begging them not to leave him behind. Other times, the voices slipped into the tones of people none of them recognized. Men, women, children, layered into a chorus of suffering. And then came the moments that struck deepest. Voices that mimicked their own, repeating words they hadn't yet spoken, mocking their thoughts before they were even voiced aloud. They pressed their hands against their ears, but the sound seeped in anyway, vibrating against bone. The forest was not speaking with air and lungs. It spoke directly into their minds. The darkness deepened, and the shapes returned. This time they didn't linger at the tree line. They stepped closer. Between the trees, figures leaned forward, tall, twisted, their silhouettes impossible to define. The fire cast them into sharper relief, but it only made them more wrong, legs too long, heads bent at angles that no neck could hold. Their faces were voids, hollow sockets that reflected light without having eyes. The cameras captured some of it, but not all. On the screens, the figures glitched, fracturing into static, skipping frames. 1 second they were distant, the next impossibly near. Each freeze frame revealed something different. A mouth too wide, a hand stretched longer than an arm should allow, a shadow that did not align with the body casting it. The group huddled tighter around the fire. Their breaths came shallow, quick, trembling. The clearing pulsed with a sense of pressure, like the air before a storm, only heavier, thicker, suffocating. Then came the moment that shattered whatever was left of their courage. The audio recorder, left in the center of the camp, clicked on by itself. At first, it replayed their own voices, conversations from earlier in the day. But as the playback continued, the words warped, twisted, the cadence slowing, deepening, until their laughter became guttural sobs. Then new sounds emerged, layered over the recordings. Screams, moans, the unmistakable tearing of something wet. One of them snapped, lunging forward to smash the recorder. The device cracked, sparks spitting out. But even as it lay broken, the voices didn't stop. They had never come from the machine. The recorder had only been a conduit. The forest laughed. Not with joy, but with malice. A sound like trees splitting under pressure, like dry leaves tearing slowly apart. From then on, the night dissolved into a spiral of hallucination and reality, indistinguishable from one another. Each of them saw things the others didn't. A figure crouched inside their tent, a pale hand sliding into the fire without burning, a face staring from within the flames. Some of them swore they felt touches, cold fingers dragging across their backs, a pressure against their shoulders, hot breath against their necks. The ground itself seemed to shift. Roots bulged upward, twisting like skeletal arms, clutching at their boots, pulling at their ankles. The soil reeked of rot, as though the earth itself was decomposing beneath them. Time unraveled. They lost track of hours, minutes, even seconds. At one point, they believed dawn had come, only to realize the glow was not sunlight, but the fire consuming itself into white-hot embers. One of them broke into sobs, whispering over and over that Aaron was standing at the tree line, that he was smiling, that he wanted them to join him. The others saw nothing, or maybe they did, but were too terrified to admit it aloud. The longer they stared into the forest, the more it stared back. The figures multiplied, forming a ring just beyond the clearing, patient, waiting, and among them, occasionally, they swore they saw familiar shapes. People they knew, family members, long dead or still alive. Their faces stretched wrong but recognizable enough to cut deep. By what must have been the final hour before dawn, the group had collapsed into something worse than fear. Resignation. They no longer whispered plans of escape. They no longer spoke of surviving. The forest had eroded their will. leaving behind husks that twitched at every sound but could not act. When the first pale light finally broke through the canopy, it brought no relief. The shapes did not vanish. They merely retreated, folding backward into the trees, their bodies breaking into fragments as though made of smoke and bone. The voices faded, but not completely. They lingered, soft, promising that night would return, and with it, so would they. The clearing looked ordinary again in daylight. Birds sang, insects hummed, and the fire crackled gently. But the group sat in silence, their eyes vacant, their minds fractured. They understood what the forest wanted. It would not stop. It would keep pulling them apart, piece by piece, voice by voice, until nothing was left but more hollow echoes to join its chorus. By the time the final night came, none of them spoke of leaving. The thought had vanished, eroded by exhaustion and the forest's relentless grip. They sat like statues around the fire, faces drawn and pale, eyes sunken into shadow. Every movement felt heavy, drained of purpose. Their bodies were present, but their wills had already begun to dissolve into the wood around them. The clearing had changed. The tree line seemed closer now, pressing inward, the trunks bent at impossible angles, as though the forest itself had shifted to cage them in. The air was suffocating, damp with rot, thick with the metallic tang of something old and decayed. The fire hissed and spat, but its glow seemed weaker, swallowed quickly by the surrounding black. The voices began before the sun had fully set. They weren't whispers this time. They were conversations. Layers of speech, some recognizable, some alien, flowing through the trees as though 100 unseen mouths spoke at once. The voices wove around each other, rising and falling like the tide. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they screamed, sometimes they called out names in tones so perfect, so familiar, that each of them froze in dread. Aaron's voice returned, stronger than before, pleading, desperate, begging them to follow, to come back to him. One of the group broke, stumbling toward the tree line with arms outstretched, convinced their friend was there. The others clung to him, dragging him back, but the forest howled at their defiance. A sound like timber splitting, like 1,000 bones snapping in unison. Shapes emerged again, but they no longer kept their distance. They stepped into the clearing, slow, deliberate, as though the boundary of firelight meant nothing now. Their forms shimmered, folding in and out of clarity, sometimes solid, sometimes fractured, like film burned and stitched back together. Their faces were wrong, but hauntingly familiar, resembling people the group had once loved, but hollowed, empty-eyed, stretched into grotesque imitations. The air grew colder with each step the figures took. Frost crawled across the ground, lacing the edges of their tents, frosting the blackened branches above. Their breath plumed white, trembling in the dim light. The fire roared suddenly, flaring high, almost desperate, as if it too fought to survive. In its blaze, the figure's features became clearer. mouths opening too wide, showing teeth that weren't teeth, but jagged shards of bone. Fingers elongating, splitting into more fingers, reaching hungrily toward the living. The group collapsed into chaos. One screamed until his voice broke. Another tried to pray, words stumbling out in broken fragments, swallowed by the laughter rising from the woods. Someone grabbed the laptop, desperate to prove this was real, desperate to catch what their eyes couldn't process. But the screen erupted into static the moment it turned on, filling with flickering images of their own faces, distorted, mouths stretched in silent screams. Then the forest spoke as one, not with whispers, not with mimicry, but with a single voice, deep and hollow, resonating through the soil, the air, their bones. Stay. The word shook the clearing, vibrating the ground, rattling their teeth. It was not a request. It was a command. One by one, they began to break. The one who had nearly followed Aaron earlier now rose again, this time walking straight into the dark without resistance. The forest swallowed him instantly. No cry, no struggle, only silence. Another collapsed beside the fire, eyes rolling back, his breath ceasing as if the forest had reached into his chest and plucked it away. The survivors clung together, trembling, tears cutting lines through the ash on their faces. They tried to resist, but resistance felt meaningless. The forest had chosen, and they were its offering. The last moment stretched long and cruel. Figures encircled them, bending low, their hollow sockets inches from the survivors' faces. Cold seeped into their skin, deeper than frost, deeper than death, pulling not at flesh, but at the very core of who they were. Their thoughts fractured, their memories dissolving. Each scream died in their throats, replaced with silence. And when the fire finally burned itself out, when the clearing was nothing but shadow and ash, the group was gone. By dawn, the forest stood in silence, unchanged and indifferent. The tents remained, sagging, half-collapsed, dew glistening on the fabric. The cameras still blinked red, recording nothing but empty clearing. The laptop lay open, its screen cracked, frozen on the distorted image of faces that no longer existed. Hikers who stumbled upon the site weeks later would find the equipment, the remnants of camp. But no bodies, no footprints leading away. Only the faint impression in the dirt where figures had once sat in a circle, staring into a fire that had long since died. And at night, those who dared to stay close to the clearing swore they heard it still. The voices, overlapping, hollow, whispering in tones both strange and familiar. Some claimed they even heard their own names carried in the wind, spoken from the trees. The forest did not give back what it took. It only collected, adding more voices to its chorus, waiting patiently for the next to wander too deep, to listen too closely, to stay too long. Because the forest was always hungry. and the forest always remembered.